August 1945. Nazi Germany is gone. Mussolini is dead. Only one enemy remains, Japan. But even as their empire burns, Tokyo refuses to surrender. So the United States prepares Operation Downfall, a full-scale invasion that could cost over 1 million lives. Then, one man makes a decision that will change history forever. Not one bomb. 2. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. Cities turn to Kara Ashkui in seconds, hundreds of thousands dead. And the man behind that order, not a general, not a scientist, just a former farmer from Missouri named Harry S. Truman. Some call him a hero, others call him a war criminal. But one thing is certain, you live in his world. So who was Truman? Let's go back to the moment the world changed and meet the man who changed it. The man known to history as Harry Truman was born. Harry S. Truman. On May 8th, 1884, in the small town of Lamar, Missouri, located 120 miles south of Kansas City. His ancestors on both paternal and maternal sides had moved to Missouri from Kentucky. His paternal grandfather, Anderson Ship Truman, made the journey by horseback in 1846. Harry's father, John Anderson Truman, born in 1851, spent most of his life working as a farmer and livestock dealer. Though often regarded as a sharp and assertive businessman, John was a mild-mannered father who enjoyed singing while his wife played piano beside him. Harry's mother, Martha Ellen Young, married John in December 1881. The Koch-Young family had settled in Missouri in 1841, and Harry's grandfather, Solomon Young, gradually accumulated thousands of acres of land. Missouri, one of 4 slave-holding states that stayed in the Union during the Civil War, nonetheless saw Union troops raid the Young farm several times between 1861 and 1863. Martha, just under 9 years old when the first raid occurred, carried a deep resentment toward Northerners from the East Coast for the rest of her life. In 1868, at age 17, she was sent to Lexington Baptist Female College. After 2 years of studying music and art, the outspoken Martha rarely involved herself in the farm work or domestic duties, even after marrying John and moving into a newly built home in Lamar, following a stillborn child in the fall of 1882. Martha gave birth to Harry in May 1884. He was named after her brother, Harrison Young. The couple couldn't agree on which grandfather's name should be used for Harry's middle name, so they compromised with the letter Tikis Kiwari, which might have stood for Solomon or Ship, but officially represented neither. Harry Truman's early childhood involved frequent moves. The family relocated several times as John Truman struggled financially. In 1887, they moved to the Kenai Young Farm near Katy Grand View, where John assumed control of a 600-acre section and helped his father-in-law manage a nearby 1,000-acre plot. By April 1886, the Trumans welcomed another son, John Vivian Truman, affectionately known as Vivian. Then, in August 1889, Martha gave birth to a daughter, Mary Jane, who became Harry's closest childhood companion, although Harry had a near-death scare at age 4 after swallowing a peach stone. He looked back fondly on his time at the young farm chasing his brother through pastures or playing chess and cards with his uncle Harrison. At the 4th of July celebration in 1889, the family noticed something unusual. Harry reacted with delight to the white sound of exploding fireworks, but barely looked at the display itself. Alarmed that her son might be going blind, Martha took him to an eye doctor in Kansas City. He was diagnosed with oddly flat eyeballs, a condition of nearsightedness that required thick corrective lenses. Determined her children receive a proper education, Martha moved the family in 1809 to Independence, Missouri, a town widely praised for having the finest public schools in the state. Founded in 1827, Independence had once served as a key departure point for pioneers heading west to Oregon, Tigakiti, California, Denani, or Santa Fe, Nan. By the time the Trumans arrived, the town had long recovered from the Cadic Civil War and housed around 6,000 residents, though it remained overshadowed by Kansas City. In the fall of 1892, Harry was enrolled at Antiu Nolan School. Unlike many of his peers, he had few chances to play outside, as his mother insisted he help with household chores. Later, he worked part-time at a local drugstore. Baseball was off-limits. A stray ball could easily ruin his expensive glasses. Instead, he inherited his mother's passion for music and practiced piano 2 hours each day. In January 1894, both Harry and Vivian were struck down by diphtheria. Though Harry's recovery was slow, he returned to school later that year, caught up quickly, and was even allowed to skip 3rd grade, transferring to Columbian School. Harry received a strong education and consistently excelled in both mathematics and the humanities. He became a regular at the Public Library and immersed himself in biographies of great historical figures. He dreamed of becoming a great general like Napoleon or Hannibal. And when the Spanish-American War erupted in 1898, the 14-year-old Harry Truman and his friends organized a pretend military unit of their own. Politics wasn't yet a priority for him. Still, his father was a devoted Democrat, and in 900 Harry served as a page at the Democratic National Convention in Kansas City. There, populist icon William Jennings Bryan was nominated once again to face off against Republican William McKinley in a rematch of the 1896 presidential election. After completing school in 1900, Truman was eager to join the White Army, but quickly discovered that his poor eyesight made him ineligible for admission. The family couldn't afford to send him to the University of Missouri, so he enrolled in a commercial college in Kansas City, where he likely studied bookkeeping and typewriting. His plans were abruptly derailed in 1902 when his father lost a substantial sum of money speculating on grain. Forced to find work, Harry took a brief job in the mailroom of the Kansas City Star, followed by a 6-month stretch as a timekeeper at a railroad construction company. In February 1903, he moved to Kansas City and joined the Huo National Commerce Bank, where co-workers soon recognized him as both capable and diligent. After a couple of years, he transitioned to the competing Union National Bank. Alongside his growing knowledge of finance and economics, Truman was introduced for the first time to the energy and allure of urban life. He became especially drawn to Kansas City's cultural scene with Burward. In 1905, the celebrated Polish composer and pianist Ignacy Jan Paderewski performed before a crowd of Olkit Sek Aden at Chatham Convention Hall. Truman would later recall how, after the concert, his piano teacher brought him to meet the great artist. When Truman mentioned his difficulty mastering a section of Paderewski's Minuet in G, the composer graciously sat at the piano and demonstrated the proper technique, giving him an impromptu 15-minute lesson. Truman also attended performances by the visiting Metropolitan Opera of New York, though he found grand opera too overwhelming, and instead gravitated toward theater and lighter musical fare. That same year, 1905, having reached the age of Tamar, Truman enlisted in the KC-2 Missouri National Guard. Wearing his crisp blue uniform, he visited the Young family farm, only to be met with stern disapproval from his elderly grandmother, who remarked, "Harry, this is the first time since 1863 that a blue uniform has been in this house. Don't bring it here again." Truman's time in the city came to an abrupt end. In 1906, when his parents' crops failed. Obligated by family duty, he returned to the Kakyung farm to help out. The spacious farmhouse where Harry had spent his early childhood had burned down in 1893, just a year after the death of his grandfather, Solomon. In its place, his grandmother had built a far simpler, more modest home. Truman would spend the next 11 years working on the farm, much of that time, side by side with his father, until the latter's death in 1914, eager to modernize their operation. He read widely on contemporary agricultural techniques and emerging technologies, determined to eradicate weeds and revitalize the soil. Truman adopted high crop rotation practices. He replaced the old walking plow with a more efficient, horse-drawn model. His workdays were long and demanding, often stretching to 12 hours or more, especially during the harvest season. The family maintained a large herd of cattle, which they sold to the beef-hungry market in Kansas City. But Truman had no love for cows. He found them irritatingly uncooperative, once complaining with exasperation that they never do as they're told, and they're a pain to milk. On one occasion, he and his father spent a full 30 minutes chasing down a particularly obstinate cow to sell to a prospective buyer, only for John to decline the sale after weighing the animal. One day in 1913, while Harry was setting a fence post, one of the cows suddenly lunged at him, fracturing his leg after a ruinous cholera epidemic in 1912 wiped out most of Truman's pigs. He undertook the labor-intensive task of vaccinating the surviving hogs. It should be noted that Truman's life up to his 30s, shaped by persistent financial hardship, barred from elite universities, and spent running a small farm to support his wider family was extraordinarily rare for someone who would later become President of the United States. Most other 20th century presidents attended Ivy League colleges, then pursued careers in law, business, academia, or similar fields before entering politics. From 1910 onward, most of Truman's spare time was devoted to courting Ibes Wallace, a young woman from Independence, whom he had first met when the pair were school children. Although Harry had long been quietly smitten with her, the well-to-do Wallaces moved in more affluent social circles, giving him few chances to socialize with her. In December 1910, while visiting relatives in Independence, Harry noticed an empty plate originally part of a cake sent by Bess's mother that needed returning. Seizing the moment, he delivered the plate himself and was greeted by Bess, who invited him inside. From then on, the two met regularly on weekends, either in Independence or Kansas City. Harry soon proposed marriage. He was politely refused, understanding that Bess's mother was reluctant to let her daughter marry a man of such modest means. Determined to improve his prospects, he spent the next few years chasing fortune, entering lotteries for land grants in South Dakota and Montana, cooking up schemes with Uncle Harrison, and eventually joining a zinc mining venture in Oklahoma in 1914. The operation proved fruitless, and he quickly cut his losses. But in 1916, he invested $5,000 in an oil exploration project in Kansas, serving as treasurer in the firm's Kansas City office during the winter. The company drilled each 900-foot hole searching for oil, but America's entry into World War I soon caused a manpower shortage and forced the operation to shut down. Ironically, a different company would later strike oil at the exact same site. By now, in his mid-30s, Truman felt that luck perpetually eluded him. America's entry into World War I, in April 1917, finally gave him the chance to join the Army. Previously, his poor eyesight had been an obstacle, but enlistment standards were relaxed to recruit more men. Although he had given up his artillery duties in the Missouri Guard, in 1911, he helped reorganize the light artillery batteries into 2 regiments and was quickly promoted to our first lieutenant in the 429th Field Artillery Regiment. The unit trained at Camp Doniphan in Oklahoma under Colonel Carl Clem, a Kansas City native and 107 West Point graduate. Truman excelled at running the regimental canteen, with a fellow officer going to great lengths to supply the men with whatever they needed. By spring 1918, the regiment was ready to depart. They landed in France and on 13th April, amid the German spring offensive against British and French lines. Despite urgent pleas from Allied commanders, the commander-in-chief of the American forces in France, General John J. Pershing, insisted that his men be thoroughly trained before seeing combat. After 3 months of preparation, Captain Harry Truman became commander of the Battery D in Haiti, July 1918. He instilled discipline in his men and earned their respect, drilling them so they could move and operate their Kaigi artillery pieces as efficiently as possible. After a baptism of fire in the Paix, Vosges Mountains, the battery was present at the Battle of Saint-Mihiel in mid-September, though saw no action, to reach their position for the Meuse-Argonne offensive, which Pershing launched on 26 September. Captain Truman marched his battery under cover of darkness for more than 20 nights. On one occasion, Truman saw an enemy battery setting up within range and obliterated it with 8 suppressing fire. When Colonel Clem threatened to court-martial him for firing into another division's sector, Truman coolly challenged him to proceed. No further action was taken. After being rotated from the line, the battery spent 3 weeks at the de Verdun front before the peace armistice was signed on the 23 November 1918, bringing the war to a close. The cessation of hostilities allowed the troops to unwind, and in late November, Truman toured Paris before heading to the Mediterranean coast, visiting Marseille, Nice, and Monaco. A shortage of ships kept the troops on French soil for several months, and Truman had to keep his restless men in good order. He longed only to return to Bess, who had finally agreed to marry him before he left for war. In letters to her, he wrote that he cared little about what President Woodrow Wilson was negotiating at the Paris Peace Conference. He simply wanted to come home. Now that the fighting was over, Battery D boarded a steamer in April 1919 and reached New York on the 20th. After a celebratory parade in Kansas City, the unit was demobilized on 6 May 1919. Although Truman served barely 2 years in uniform, biographer Ada Donald notes that he considered it his greatest service to his country, even above his presidency. He stayed close to his comrades in arms, who presented him with a cup inscribed Captain Harry S. Truman, presented by the members of Battery D, in appreciation of his justice, ability, and leadership. On 28 June 1919, Truman married Bess at Trinity Episcopal Church in Independence. The couple moved into Bess's grandmother's house at 219 Delaware Street, where Bess and her mother had lived since her father's death in 1903. Already in their mid-30s, the newlyweds would nonetheless share 53 years of marriage. Barely a month before the ceremony, Truman teamed up with his wartime comrade Eddie Jacobson, leasing a Kansas City haberdashery that specialized in men's apparel. To bankroll the shop, Truman put up most of the capital, liquidating his share of the family farm along with the equipment. The Truman and Jacobson store grew straight out of their smoothly run regimental canteen of 1917 to 18. When the doors opened in November 1919, veterans of the 129th Field Artillery quickly became loyal patrons. The location set in a chic district and the roaring post-war economy sent sales soaring. Still wearing a reserve officer's uniform, Truman in 1920 spearheaded formation of a Reserve Officers Association in Kansas City, a model that soon spread nationwide and yielded a federal umbrella body 2 years later, with the American Legion slated to stage its inaugural national convention in Kansas City in 1921. Truman served as vice chair of the Decorations Committee, canvassing businesses citywide for flags to welcome dignitaries such as General Pershing, Marshal Foch, and British Admiral Sir David Beatty. Even though the convention proved a triumph, the youth's economy lurched into crisis that same year. European turmoil torpedoed American exports and sent prices into freefall. Overnight, the partners' inventory, initially valued at 30,000 yarn, was worth a fraction, and the shop folded in April 1922. Both men wrestled with repayments on a Security State Bank loan. Jacobson eventually filed for bankruptcy in 1925, but Truman, already an elected official, was shielded from court proceedings. At the haberdashery's collapse, he was pushing 40, having cycled through assorted jobs with little direction or conspicuous success. That summer of 1921, as the business tottered, fellow 129th Artillery veteran Jim Pendergast paid Truman a visit, accompanied by his father, Michael, who managed the Jackson County Democratic machine on behalf of his brother. Tom, the real power in Kansas City. They needed a candidate for Eastern Jackson County in 1922 who could eclipse rivals Miles Bulger and Joseph Shannon. Truman struck the Pendergasts as someone who looked independent of the machine and whose farm roots plus war record would resonate with voters. Throughout the primary, he maintained a careful distance, and the Pendergasts endorsed him only late in the race. Truman tirelessly campaigned across eastern Jackson County. But eloquence was not his strong suit, so much so that even his devoted supporters joked about having drifted off during his speeches. On election night, Truman held a precarious lead, fewer than 80 votes ahead of Shannon's candidate, forcing his team to intervene decisively to thwart the opponent's attempts at ballot box tampering. The November general election proved far less contentious, as Truman comfortably secured victory, gathering over 9,000 votes compared to just over 6,000 for his Republican rival, in what was then a solidly Democratic state. Truman's 2-year term representing eastern Jackson County, from January 1923 until January 1925, marked the modest beginning of a political trajectory that would eventually elevate him to the presidency just 2 decades later, deeply embedded within the Pendergast machine. Truman acquired invaluable first-hand knowledge of the Machiavellian intricacies characterizing political power struggles. He joined forces with Western Judge Henry McElroy, a seasoned Pendergast ally, to skillfully outmaneuver the presiding judge Elihu Hayes, who was supported by the Shannon faction within the county. Their attention soon turned to Miles Bulger, a figure infamous for founding an orphanage whose construction somehow absorbed the staggering sum of $165,000, intended to house merely 60 children. Even more brazenly, this included over $1,000 squandered on a bronze plaque at the entrance, engraved prominently with Bulger's name. Truman and McElroy swiftly pushed for an investigation into this outrageous spending, quickly uncovering interiors extravagantly adorned with marble and ornate wooden paneling, luxuries that defied any plausible justification. A subsequent audit delivered even more alarming revelations during Bulger's 8-year tenure as presiding judge. The county deficit had skyrocketed from a negligible $117 to a staggering $1.2 million. Yet, despite these scandalous discoveries, Truman ultimately failed in his re-election bid. Over the next 2 years, he resorted to taking various odd jobs to support his family, especially following the birth of his only child, Mary Margaret Truman, in February 1924. By January 1927. However, Truman had successfully reclaimed public office. Though still working closely alongside Tom Pendergast, Truman preserved an admirable degree of independence. He dutifully dispensed government positions promised by the local party machine, yet simultaneously cultivated a reputation for honesty, fairness, and transparency. He earnestly sought to eliminate corruption as best he could, but privately acknowledged that his fellow political operatives required some modest portion of any deal to secure their cooperation, though Truman himself steadfastly refused to pocket a single penny. Truman's hallmark achievement during his 8-year tenure as presiding judge, 1927 to 1935, was an expansive and ambitious infrastructure initiative to reduce corruption risks. He introduced a confidential bidding system for contracts. Under Truman's watch, more than 300 miles were added to the county's existing network of 1,100 miles of roads. He also spearheaded the renovation of the courthouse in Independence, meticulously modeling it after Philadelphia's iconic Independence Hall, and oversaw the construction of a strikingly modern Art Deco courthouse in Kansas City. After nearly a decade immersed in local governance, Truman began aspiring to higher office. In January 1934, he informed Pendergast of his desire to run for the House of Representatives, representing Missouri's 4th District, covering eastern Jackson County and parts of Kansas City. Pendergast, however, unexpectedly advised him to aim instead for the U.S. Senate. Initially skeptical, Truman worried that the political boss simply wished to discard him, given that county-level officials rarely ascended directly to the Senate without first serving in the House of Representatives. But Truman's suspicion was misplaced. By 1934, Tom Pendergast effectively controlled Missouri's political landscape, yet sought a Senate candidate capable of counterbalancing Bennett Clark, whose father, Champ Clark, had dominated Democratic politics in St. Louis. After offering the candidacy to 4 or 5 other individuals, Pendergast eventually settled on Truman, fully aware of his limited name recognition, yet convinced of his potential as a loyal and dependable ally. Truman was ultimately persuaded by Jackson County Party Chairman James Aylward, who assured him the machine could mobilize sufficient votes, and on the 13th of May, 1934, Aylward, along with Jim Pendergast, convinced Truman to enter the race. He traveled tirelessly from county to county, waging an arduous campaign against 2 formidable rivals, Jacob Milligan, backed by Clark, and Congressman John Cochran of St. Louis. There were few substantial policy differences among the 3 men, all of whom aligned closely with President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. Initiatives aimed at revitalizing the economy during the Great Depression, while Cochran could credibly present himself as independent from political machines. Truman emphasized his wartime credentials and agricultural background qualities that resonated deeply with voters in rural counties. With the Pendergast machine mobilizing a substantial turnout in Kansas City, Truman emerged victorious in the Democratic primary, by an impressive margin of 40,000 votes, later securing an easy win over the Republican candidate in the November general election. However, upon arriving in Washington, D.C. in January 1935 to assume his Senate seat, Truman encountered a chilly reception. Fellow Democrats sarcastically dubbed him the senator from Pendergast, and despite his admiration for President Roosevelt, Truman managed to secure only a brief 15-minute meeting with him, an audience that took 5 months to arrange. Truman did not deliver his maiden speech on the Senate floor until 1937, and rarely spoke during his early years in the chamber. Unlike his colleague Bennett Clark, who frequently opposed Roosevelt's agenda, Truman demonstrated consistent loyalty to the president, reliably supporting most New Deal legislation. Though Truman had hoped for a seat on the influential Military Affairs Committee, he instead had to settle for a place on the Interstate Commerce Committee. In this role, Truman capitalized on his experience managing road infrastructure projects back in Jackson County. However, the committee's oversight extended further to railroads, shipping, and the burgeoning aviation industry. He served diligently on an aviation subcommittee and sponsored legislation establishing a Civil Aeronautics Board under presidential supervision. Truman's contribution to the Civil Aeronautics Act of 1938 became a foundation for the Transportation Bill. He later co-sponsored with his friend Burton Wheeler, the Democratic senator from Montana. The duo carefully navigated competing interests, particularly the tensions between rail and inland water transport industries. Truman and Wheeler, both hailing from largely rural states, understood firsthand the frustrations of farmers who accused railroad companies of charging excessively to transport their goods to major coastal markets. In 1937, they summoned railroad executives to testify before the committee, exposing their practices of prioritizing dividend payouts over job creation, maintenance, and infrastructure improvements, mindful of balancing interests fairly. Truman and Wheeler crafted their legislation to ensure equitable competition across transport sectors by bringing water carriers firmly under the regulatory oversight of the Interstate Commerce Commission. This landmark legislation, known as the Wheeler Transportation Act, was passed in September 1940, shortly after Truman had narrowly survived his own Democratic primary battle, winning by a slim margin of just 1%. Truman's political troubles stemmed largely from the unraveling of the Pendergast machine. Tom Pendergast's declining health and spiraling gambling addiction, leading to losses amounting to hundreds of thousands of dollars on horse races, compelled him to accept increasingly large bribes to remain financially afloat. During the 1936 gubernatorial election, despite minimal opposition, Pendergast orchestrated blatant vote-rigging efforts to support Lloyd Stark, generating more ballots than there were eligible voters. Upon taking office, Stark quickly turned against his patron, with President Roosevelt backing Stark's campaign to dismantle the corrupt Pendergast organization. Truman, largely unaware of the depth of Pendergast's corruption, publicly defended his former political benefactor on the Senate floor. He was genuinely stunned when the full extent of the scandal emerged after Pendergast was indicted by a grand jury in April 1939, charged with accepting a staggering $750,000 bribe to facilitate a favorable settlement for 14 insurance companies. Within weeks, Pendergast was incarcerated, and his once powerful political machine rapidly collapsed. As the 1940 elections approached, Roosevelt openly supported Stark's challenge for Truman's Senate seat and offered Truman instead a prestigious lifetime appointment on the Interstate Commerce Commission. Truman defiantly refused this offer, setting the stage for a challenging battle against Governor Stark. Initially, Truman felt confused when one of his aides encouraged District Attorney Maurice Milligan, who had played a critical role in bringing down the Pendergast political machine, to enter the electoral race. Milligan's entry unintentionally split the anti-corruption vote, and thanks to last-minute support from Truman's Senate colleague, Bennett Clark, Truman secured the nomination by winning decisive votes from St. Louis. Subsequently, in the general election of November 1940, Truman convincingly defeated his Republican opponent. In that same election cycle, Roosevelt was elected to an unprecedented third presidential term, something previously unheard of, as there was no constitutional limit on presidential terms. At the time, this only changed after the ratification of the 22nd Amendment in 1951. Roosevelt's third-term candidacy was justified by the extraordinary national emergency facing the country. The Second World War had broken out in Europe in September 1939. Although Roosevelt had pledged to keep the U.S. out of the conflict, the fall of France to Nazi Germany in June 1940 compelled the administration to initiate a large-scale rearmament program. Truman was pleased that Missouri benefited from the rearmament effort, but remained particularly focused on ensuring that public funds were spent efficiently. During a personal inspection tour of Army camps, Truman discovered contractors were incentivized to charge excessively high fees, while smaller businesses were excluded from bidding. He also clashed sharply with Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, over ship production rates, and frequently criticized the War Production Board, an agency established in January 1942, just a month after the U.S. entered the war following Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. Truman played a key role in promoting increased industrial production capacity, enabling it to meet escalating wartime demands by late 1943. Despite frequent complaints about various federal agencies, Truman maintained a cordial relationship with Roosevelt, who was preparing to run for a fourth presidential term in 1944. Despite declining health, senior figures within the Democratic Party believed Roosevelt would not survive another 4 years and pressed him to drop Vice President Henry Wallace, whom they considered excessively left-wing. In early 1944, Roosevelt ultimately agreed to remove Wallace from the ticket. The chairman of the Democratic National Committee at the time was Robert Hennigan from St. Louis, who had supported Truman's Senate re-election bid in 1940. Hennigan was among those who urged Roosevelt to accept Truman as his running mate in July. However, Roosevelt did not publicly declare his support for Truman, and two other vice presidential candidates, including Wallace, still believed they had Roosevelt's backing entering the Democratic Convention held in Chicago. When Truman first heard his name mentioned as a potential vice presidential nominee earlier in the year, he hurriedly instructed a friend to let it be known he did not wish to be considered. He was concerned that the press would uncover that he had been paying his wife a salary of $4,500 from the Senate payroll since 1941 to help support their family finances. Truman only learned officially that he was the president's chosen candidate on July 19th in Chicago. After a period of initial hesitation, Roosevelt was compelled to summon party leaders to a meeting and firmly declared, "Tell him that if he wants to split the Democratic Party in the middle of a war, that will be his responsibility." Faced with this high-pressure ultimatum, Truman reluctantly accepted the nomination. On August 18, 1944, Truman met Roosevelt for lunch at the White House, where Roosevelt candidly confessed, "Harry, I'm not a well man, and we cannot be sure of my future." Truman followed the ailing president's advice against traveling by airplane and instead conducted his campaign tour across the country by train. Roosevelt secured an easy victory in the November election, and Truman was sworn in as vice president on January 20th, 1945. As vice president, Truman's authority was extremely limited, a reality that would change only in more recent times as the role of vice president became more significant. Historically, the office had primarily a ceremonial function. Truman carried out his duties as President of the Senate, fully aware that he might have to assume the presidency at any moment if Roosevelt's health deteriorated further. Thus, it came as no great surprise when, on the afternoon of April 12, 1945, he was urgently summoned to the White House and greeted by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who informed him that her husband had passed away. Chief Justice Harlan Stone and senior cabinet members were immediately summoned, and just after 7 o'clock that evening, Harry S. Truman took the oath of office as the 33rd President of the United States. At this point, Truman was approaching his 61st birthday, only 2 years younger than his late predecessor, but in significantly better physical health. Under Roosevelt, the federal government had expanded significantly, but he was a hands-on president who did not like delegating responsibilities to his cabinet secretaries immediately upon assuming office. Truman quickly set about reorganizing the administration, replacing 6 incumbent cabinet secretaries within his first 3 months, and appointing his closest aides into key senior staff positions at the White House. His most trusted advisor was Press Secretary Charlie Ross, an old friend from his school days who had previously worked as a journalist for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Only a few weeks after taking office, Truman surprised many observers by reaching out to Roosevelt's Republican predecessor, former President Herbert Hoover, requesting him to carry out a comprehensive survey of global food supplies. In 1947, Truman once again caused surprise by inviting Hoover to head the Commission on Organization of the Executive Branch of Government. Hoover genuinely astonished Truman when he presented proposals aimed at improving governmental efficiency, emphasizing strengthening the roles and capacities of cabinet departments, rather than adhering to the traditional Republican stance of reducing the federal government's powers. Truman had entered the presidency at a moment when the Allies were on the verge of victory in Europe, and Germany surrendered shortly thereafter, on May 8, 1945. Yet at that time, America was still engaged in a fierce war against Japan, a nation certain to lose, yet apparently having no intention of surrendering quickly. Truman relied heavily on advice from ambassadors and senior State Department officials when shaping his foreign policy. Although the capitalist United States and Communist Soviet Union had been allies during their struggle against fascist Germany, the American foreign policy establishment was particularly concerned about ensuring Soviet leader Joseph Stalin fulfilled his commitment to allow free elections in Eastern Europe. As a gesture of goodwill, Truman ordered the withdrawal of American troops from the Soviet-controlled zone in eastern Germany in June 1945. In July of that year, Truman traveled to Germany for the Potsdam Conference, meeting Stalin and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Discussions at Potsdam primarily centered around the future of Eastern Europe, especially Poland. Throughout the war, a Polish government in exile had operated from London, but since the Soviet Red Army had occupied Poland on its way into Germany, both Britain and the US accepted recognition of the Soviet-established Polish government after Stalin agreed to appoint several non-communist ministers. Nevertheless, Truman often felt irritated by Stalin's rigid and uncompromising attitude. Even though the Americans and British continually offered concessions, Truman later recounted how, when he once mentioned the Catholic Church's perspective on a certain issue, Stalin cynically replied, "How many divisions does the Pope have?" The relationship between Truman and Stalin clearly lacked the warmth and close rapport Roosevelt had cultivated with the Soviet leader. One inevitably wonders whether the Cold War might have unfolded differently had there existed a less tense relationship between these two leaders, given the increasing global tensions emerging everywhere in the post-war world. On July the 16th, 1945, shortly after Truman arrived in Potsdam, Germany, he received news about the successful testing of the first atomic bomb at Alamogordo, New Mexico, where the Manhattan Project had secretly been developing this devastating weapon for several years. Approximately 1 week later, during an apparently casual conversation with Stalin, Truman discreetly mentioned that the United States had just developed a weapon possessing extraordinary destructive power, as American soldiers were still fiercely fighting and sacrificing their lives across the Pacific Front. The atomic bomb emerged as a decisive option to bring the war swiftly to an end. During the summer of 1945, the U.S. Air Force had already unleashed devastating firebombing raids upon Japanese cities, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of civilians. Yet the Japanese government appeared steadfast in its determination to fight to the bitter end. At that time, American military commanders were carefully preparing plans for a massive invasion of the Japanese home islands. Estimates of expected U.S. military casualties ranged from a staggering $250,000 up to as high as 1.5 million, with Japanese losses predicted to far exceed even those daunting figures, although no one could be entirely certain about the destructive capability of the atomic bomb. Truman and his advisors concluded that utilizing such a weapon represented the most reasonable choice, particularly when weighed against the immense loss of life that would inevitably follow an amphibious invasion of mainland Japan. While Truman was attending the Potsdam Conference, the Americans issued a stern ultimatum, warning Japan of catastrophic destruction if immediate surrender was not forthcoming. After the Japanese refused to heed this demand, on August 6th, the city of Hiroshima was obliterated by the first atomic bomb. Merely 3 days later, Nagasaki suffered the same devastating fate. Simultaneously, the Soviet Union declared war against Japan and swiftly moved its forces into Manchuria, the northeastern region of China then occupied by Japanese troops. The combined effects of these developments compelled Emperor Hirohito to announce Japan's surrender less than a week after the second bomb fell on Nagasaki. Overall, Truman's decision to deploy the initial atomic bomb against Hiroshima was likely justified, as it prevented prolonged conflict and the massive casualties an invasion would have entailed. However, he arguably could have afforded Japan additional time to respond, instead of hastily deploying the second bomb on Nagasaki just 3 days later. At war's end, Truman enjoyed approval ratings above 80%. Yet, within a year, his popularity dramatically plummeted to approximately 30%. Even in his native Missouri, Truman did little to win over the press, and his tense relationship with journalists drew constant criticism, particularly about the quality of his political appointments at a time when the printed media wielded far greater influence than today. The top priority on the domestic front became demobilizing the armed forces, bringing soldiers home, and transitioning the American economy back to a peacetime footing. These tasks proved far from straightforward. Indeed, many American troops continued to occupy Germany, Japan, and other parts of the globe well into the late 1940s. Economically, wartime rationing had generated unprecedented levels of personal savings, which threatened to trigger severe inflation once consumers began spending again. Facing intense pressure from labor unions and businesses alike, Congress curtailed the powers of the Wartime Office of Price Administration, resulting in rapidly escalating prices. After June 1946, that same year, Truman faced successive waves of major strikes from auto workers and steel workers. No sooner had agreements been reached with these industries than Truman was confronted with renewed labor unrest among railroad employees and coal miners. Truman eventually compelled the mine workers to relent, but the Democrats suffered severe losses in the midterm elections, allowing the Republicans to seize control of both houses of Congress. Throughout this period, foreign policy continued to dominate the agenda of the U.S. government. In March 1946, as the Soviets systematically replaced coalition governments across Eastern Europe with communist regimes, Truman invited Winston Churchill to deliver an influential speech in Fulton, Missouri. There, the former British Prime Minister famously declared, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent." Churchill urgently called for an alliance to counteract Soviet expansionism. His speech closely followed the long telegram sent by George Kennan, the American chargé d'affaires in Moscow, who argued persuasively that Soviet ambitions in Eastern Europe, as well as in Greece, Turkey, and Iran, were merely continuations of traditional Russian imperial policy, predating even the revolution of 1917. Acknowledging that direct military confrontation with the Soviet Union was impossible, Truman adopted the policy of containment. formally articulated in March 1947 as the Truman Doctrine. This policy defined U.S. foreign strategy throughout the Cold War. In Asia, it translated into support for the Chinese nationalists during their civil war, reignited after Japan's defeat. In Europe, containment meant supporting the reconstruction of a war-ravaged continent driven by the strategic rationale that American economic aid would foster employment and stability, winning over the populations of Germany, Greece, and Turkey to the U.S. side in the emerging Cold War rivalry. This ambitious vision was spearheaded by the new Secretary of State, George Marshall. Shortly after his appointment in January 1947, Marshall swiftly initiated a landmark $13 billion assistance package, officially known as the European Recovery Act, but widely remembered as the Marshall Plan, providing crucial aid particularly to Greece and Turkey, drawing them firmly into the American sphere of influence. In June 1948, when Stalin blockaded land access to West Berlin, Truman swiftly responded by organizing British and American airlifts to supply the Anglo-American occupation zones. The Berlin airlift successfully shielded West Berlin from communist takeover, prompting Stalin to abandon the blockade by April 1949 hours. In that same month, Truman oversaw the establishment of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization NATO, an unprecedented defensive alliance uniting the United States, Canada, and 10 Western European countries in opposition to Soviet aggression. NATO endures today as the most powerful military alliance in human history. Truman faced daunting challenges heading into the 1948 presidential election. His administration's perceived shortcomings were epitomized in the popular slogan, "To err is Truman." Despite his low approval ratings, Truman secured the Democratic nomination at the July convention alongside his running mate, Senator Alben Barkley of Kentucky. The Republican opponent, Governor Thomas Dewey of New York, who had previously run unsuccessfully against Roosevelt in 1944, seemed poised for victory in peacetime. Dewey was widely favored, particularly given the Democrats' predicament of being assailed from both sides. Former Vice President Henry Wallace, representing the left-wing Progressive Party, and Governor Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, leading the conservative states' rights Democratic Party. Truman, however, waged an effective campaign, characterizing Wallace as sympathetic to communism, accusing the Republican Congress of undermining his efforts to protect freedom and democracy in Europe, and positioning himself persuasively as Roosevelt's rightful heir. Although not renowned for oratory brilliance, Truman drew enthusiastic crowds at campaign rallies and remained persistently optimistic about his chances. As election results rolled in throughout the night of November 2nd and into the early hours of November 3rd, 1948, it became clear that Truman and the Democrats were performing far better than anticipated. By 9:30 in the morning, Truman was officially declared victorious, having secured pivotal states including California, Texas, and Florida, while Democrats regained control of both houses of Congress. Famously, the pro-Republican Chicago Daily Tribune, rushing to print when Dewey's victory seemed assured, ran the premature headline, "Dewey defeats Truman." The next morning, Truman gleefully posed with a copy of this paper for photographers, creating one of the most iconic political images in American history. Truman had entered office with an ambitious domestic agenda, which included full employment initiatives, comprehensive public works projects, and substantial improvements to housing, healthcare, and education. Truman revived the ambitious domestic package and branded it his Fair Deal, intentionally echoing Roosevelt's famous New Deal. With solid backing from a Democratic-controlled Congress, Truman secured the passage of the significant Social Security Act of 1950, nearly doubling the minimum wage from £40 to 75 cents an hour. Yet, despite this victory, much of Truman's domestic agenda, from agricultural reform to healthcare and education, was ultimately blocked in Congress due to relentless lobbying pressure. Truman was also proactive in advocating civil rights. In a passionate message to Congress in February 1948, he called for the end of segregation on interstate transportation and demanded protection of voting rights for African Americans. Although he found scant support from the Democratic-controlled Congress at a time when the political landscape of America was the inverse of today, with the Democrats' core support anchored in the southern states, Truman still took meaningful steps. He ordered the desegregation of the Army through an executive mandate and encouraged Attorney General Tom Clark to actively pursue anti-segregation cases in the courts. Yet Truman's legacy regarding civil liberties remained mixed. While he backed Clark's refusal to authorize FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover's requests for wiretaps, his presidency witnessed the emergence of the Second Red Scare and the infamous period of McCarthyism, even though Truman himself was privately disgusted by Senator Joseph McCarthy's baseless accusations of communist infiltration in government. Nevertheless, there was little Truman could do to counter this rising anti-communist fervor once Republicans regained control of Congress in 1950. This intense anti-communist sentiment within the United States was partly driven by foreign policy and defense setbacks. In February 1949, Truman confided to David Lilienthal, head of the Atomic Energy Commission, that America's nuclear monopoly was a crucial deterrent against Soviet ambitions in Europe. This advantage evaporated in late August 1949, when the Soviets successfully tested their own atomic bomb, forcing the United States into a rapid expansion of its nuclear arsenal. Barely a month later, on October 1, 1949, Mao Zedong declared the founding of the People's Republic of China in Beijing after the US-backed nationalists retreated to Taiwan, abandoning mainland China to communist rule. Although Truman initially envisioned a strong, stable China as a counterbalance to Soviet influence, this proved impossible due to the rampant corruption and ineffective leadership within the nationalist regime, problems dating back to World War II. Most American financial aid was outright stolen by nationalist officials, prompting Truman eventually to scale back support for Chiang Kai-shek's faltering government. In response, Truman shifted focus toward solidifying American influence in the Philippines and Japan as principal bulwarks against communist expansion across Asia. He anticipated that South Korea would eventually succumb to the communist North. And in the late 1940s, Truman appeared reluctant to commit extensive financial and military resources needed to maintain South Korea's alignment with America during the escalating Cold War. This apparent American hesitance emboldened North Korea's Soviet-backed dictator, Kim Il-sung, to launch a full-scale invasion of the South on June 25, 1950. Truman was stunned by the scale and suddenness of this attack, quickly concluding that Kim had Stalin's full support and interpreting the aggression as the start of a broader Soviet strategy for global domination. Believing the credibility of the newly established United Nations created at the close of World War II as a body through which victorious allies aspired to maintain a peaceful post-war order was now at stake. Truman sought a UN mandate for military intervention. Due to the Soviet Union's ongoing boycott of the UN, protesting that China's Security Council seat remained in nationalist hands in Taiwan, Truman swiftly secured authorization for intervention. By July 7, 1950, a UN expeditionary force in Korea was established under American command. Although American forces had engaged in combat as early as July, by early August, they had been pushed back and trapped at the Busan perimeter, a desperate defensive position around the vital southeastern port city of Busan. With North Korea poised on the brink of total victory, General Douglas MacArthur executed a daring amphibious landing of 40,000 troops behind enemy lines at Incheon in mid-September. This dramatic move successfully recaptured Seoul and trapped North Korean forces in a stunning pincer movement. Encouraged by this military success, MacArthur, with Truman's approval, crossed the 38th parallel into North Korea. Later that September, MacArthur seemed ready to seize the entire Korean peninsula, alarming the Chinese Communist government, who feared he might cross the strategically vital Yalu River, the border separating North Korea from China. Consequently, on the 25th of November 1950, Kyiv, approximately 300,000 soldiers from China's People's Liberation Army launched a massive assault on MacArthur's forces near the Yalu River, forcing UN troops into a rapid retreat southwards. By early in the new year, the US-led UN forces had managed to stabilize the front and soon began a counterattack south of Seoul. In March 1951, Truman was ready to pursue peace negotiations along the 38th parallel, but MacArthur independently drew up his own peace conditions and publicly threatened to expand the conflict into Chinese territory. Infuriated by MacArthur's insubordination, Truman relieved the general of his command on the 10th of April. Shortly thereafter, peace talks commenced in July 1951. Nevertheless, the U.S. maintained 6 Army divisions in Korea as sporadic combat continued to flare along the contested 38th parallel. During the same period, Truman approved increased military aid to NATO, aiming to bolster Western Europe against communist influence, following the formal establishment of democratic West Germany and communist East Germany. By the conclusion of Truman's presidency, the U.S. armed forces were sufficiently robust to credibly back the nation's foreign policy. Truman, however, received little public recognition for these achievements, and by November 1951, his approval rating had fallen dramatically to 23%. Approaching his late 60s, he continued to face persistent allegations of corruption, within the White House. A prominent target was General Harry Vaughan, an old friend from Truman's service in the 129th Field Artillery, who became the president's military aide upon returning to duty during the Second World War. Vaughan openly admitted in 1951 to accepting bribes in exchange for access to Truman. Although Truman was personally innocent of the widespread corruption allegations within his administration, and later reflected that his tenure was no more corrupt than those preceding it, his stubborn loyalty toward compromised friends significantly tarnished his reputation. Despite being constitutionally eligible to seek another presidential term in 1952, having served only one full elected term, Truman ultimately decided against running again. The Democratic nominee, Governor Adlai Stevenson of Illinois, made considerable effort to distance himself from Truman and faced a daunting electoral battle against Republican nominee and popular war hero, General Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower specifically criticized Truman's inability to conclude peace negotiations in Korea, and after winning the presidency, he promptly secured the armistice agreement at Panmunjom on the 27th of July, 1953, roughly 6 months after Truman had left office. This ceasefire established an enduring truce between North and South Korea, though technically the two nations remain at war more than 7 decades later. After leaving office, Truman returned to Independence, Missouri, where he devoted himself to writing his memoirs, published in 2 volumes in 1955. The first book detailed Truman's early presidency, including the war's end in Europe, the contentious decision to deploy nuclear weapons, and the beginnings of the Cold War. The second volume addressed the subsequent 7 years of his presidency. That same year, construction began on the Truman Presidential Library in Independence. Upon its completion in 1957, Truman himself became the library's main attraction, regularly working from his office and giving guided tours. He envisioned the institution as an educational center dedicated to the study of the American presidency, and enjoyed speaking to school children in the library's auditorium. Truman continued to follow politics closely, though he expressed considerable skepticism about his successor, Eisenhower, whom he believed had become overly influenced by Republican business interests. His opinion of Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Nixon, was even lower, especially after Nixon publicly accused Truman's administration of tolerating communist infiltration in government. Initially hesitant about supporting John F. Kennedy's Democratic candidacy in 1960, Truman regarded the young senator from Massachusetts as a privileged playboy who owed his success largely to his father, Joseph Kennedy's wealth. Nevertheless, following Kennedy's nomination and subsequent election victory, Truman rallied behind him, warmly accepting an invitation with Bess to visit the White House during the winter of 1961. Truman was profoundly shaken by Kennedy's assassination in November 1963. He supported President Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society initiatives, which closely mirrored his own Fair Deal objectives. On the 30th of July, 1965, Johnson traveled to Missouri to sign Medicare into law at the Truman Library, symbolically presenting Truman with Medicare card number 1. By that time, Truman's health had begun deteriorating, notably following a fall in October 1964, significantly reducing his public appearances at the library. His final years were spent quietly in Missouri, where he passed away on the 26th of December, 1972, at the age of 88. Following a state funeral lasting 5 days, an event he had humorously pre-approved years earlier, remarking, "I want a damn fine show, I just hate that I'm not going to be around to see it," he was buried in the courtyard of the Truman Library. Harry Truman stands out as one of America's most unique presidents. His journey to power was extraordinarily unconventional compared to other 20th century American presidents, most of whom came from affluent backgrounds, graduated from Ivy League universities, and pursued prominent careers in law, business, or academia. Unlike his contemporaries, Truman entered political life only in his late 30s, coming from a humble background in rural America, where he had struggled to make ends meet as a farmer and haberdasher. His subsequent political ascent was equally unusual, relying heavily on connections to the controversial Pendergast political machine in Missouri, following a rather modest career in the Senate. Truman suddenly found himself vice president and then president during the critical closing months of the Second World War. Yet, despite this unusual path, Truman's presidency became one of the most consequential and controversial in American history. It was under his administration that the atomic bombs were deployed against Japan. The Cold War took shape, and the Korean War erupted. No president involved in events of such magnitude could avoid passionate opinions about his actions. And many today view Truman as a contentious figure in American history. The decision to use nuclear weapons in 1945 is hotly debated, though few military leaders at the time opposed the initial bombing as an alternative to a costly ground invasion of Japan. Yet Truman's approval of the second atomic bombing, only 3 days later, continues to draw intense criticism. What are your thoughts on Harry Truman? Was he an honest leader who genuinely served his country in both uniform and the Oval Office? Or was his legacy irreversibly marred by his proximity to corruption and the Pendergast machine? Do you believe his use of atomic weapons was justified to hasten the end of the war? And could he have done more to halt the spread of communism across Europe and Asia? Please share your opinions in the comments below. In the meantime, thank you very much for watching.